Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 9. Investigations. When Tally met with Alder in front of the elevator after their shift had ended, she had not the slightest idea what to expect. No more secrets, remember? Seriously, could Alder have been any more cryptic? Her partner was already waiting for her in the hallway and greeted her with her usual curt nod. She looked as composed as ever. There was absolutely nothing that gave Tally any indication about why she wanted to meet with her after their shift. Alder apparently also didn't feel the need to explain just yet. Instead, she wordlessly pressed a button to call the elevator, and once it had arrived, stepped inside and gestured for Tally to follow her. Tally did just that. She watched Alder press the top button and frowned. There was absolutely nothing interesting on the top floor, only a small laboratory and a couple of offices. Her partner seemed to notice her confusion and smirked, obviously amused by the clueless expression on Tally's face, finally breaking the silence between them. Have you ever wondered what I do after work? Tally's frown deepened, and she blushed slightly, when a couple of ideas immediately entered her head, because yes, she definitely had thought about that. None of these thoughts, however, were even remotely appropriate, and she would definitely not share them with Alder. But, apparently, the look on Tally's face spoke for itself once more, and the small smirk on Alder's face turned into a teasing grin. I meant, why I always stay here so late. Yeah, I know that's what you meant. Liar. And no, I mean, yes, I noticed, but I guess I just never put much thought into this? Well, it's hard when your thoughts are otherwise occupied. That's not... Jesus, I can only make this worse now, can't I? Your words, not mine. Alder's eyes were sparkling with mischief, and when she let out a throaty laugh, Tally couldn't help but join in. Seeing Alder laugh like that was contagious, and it made Tally sad that she only showed this side of her so rarely. This playful banter between them was new to Tally, and she was already enjoying it way too much. It also made it incredibly hard for her to keep the professional distance she promised herself to maintain between them. Tally was still laughing when the elevator came to a halt and Alder stepped into the hallway. She followed her partner down the long corridor, watched her pass a couple of offices, and then turn around a corner, stopping in front of a narrow, winding staircase that she had never noticed before. Alder didn't give her much time to think about anything and walked straight up the stairs. Tally hurriedly followed her, and together they entered a small room that Tally figured must have been initially some sort of attic. Now, however, it looked like Alder's personal headquarters. The room was tiny, barely half the size of a normal office. The only furniture in it was an old brown leather couch and a wooden desk. It would have looked entirely ordinary and boring if it hadn't been for the hundreds of pictures that were plastering the walls. Pictures of burned corpses, crime scenes, and seemingly random items, probably pieces of evidence. There was also a huge map hanging over the couch, in which various locations had been marked. On top of that, there was a stack of files lying around everywhere on the ground, making it hard to move. It didn't take a genius to understand that this was clearly the place where Alder had continued to investigate the Camarilla killer once the case had officially been closed. Welcome to my hideaway of horrors. Alder said dryly, every trace of humor in her voice suddenly gone. That's borderline obsessive? I was going to say impressive. Telly was carefully taking a step forward, only to almost fall over a bunch of binders that were piled up in front of her. And maybe just a little bit messy? Alder shrugged. Organization is the last refuge of a tired mind. She was trying to sound casual, but Telly could hear the relief about the fact that Telly was not judging her for her secret investigation and the place she had created for her work. Instead, Telly kept eyeing the room curiously, almost a bit giddy to get her hands on all the new information. Was that weird? Probably. Well, that's one way to put it. No, but seriously, this is amazing. You have collected so much information and evidence. Does the captain know about this? She knows that I spend a lot of time up here, but not just what exactly I've been up to, or how deep my investigation goes. And until now, I haven't had much reason to share it with her. It's not like I've made a major breakthrough or anything. I keep going around in circles. How much time exactly have you spent up here? Alder looked at her with tired eyes. Too much. But Telly didn't let her fall back into the hopeless resignation. Instead, she stepped closer and smiled at her sympathetically. It's a good thing that I'm here now, then. Petra certainly seems to believe that, and I have to admit, you really do good detective work. So I figured showing you this definitely wouldn't hurt. Again, Alder made it sound like nothing, but Telly could see how much she must have struggled to share the process of her investigation with her. Telly was grateful that Alder had apparently finally decided to let her fully in on anything she knew, that she was really determined to actually stick to her no more secrets promise. Thank you. I really appreciate your trust, and I am sure the captain would too. Telly then hesitated for a split second, not really sure if she should actually address what was bugging her, but Alder had already noticed her hesitation and was mustering her curiously. So bringing it up now was probably as good as any other time, and they would need to talk about it eventually. So, speaking of Captain Bellwether, I guess you figured why I talked to her this morning. Alder nodded, looking almost grateful for the change of subject. Showing emotions, and her own feelings still wasn't one of her strong suits, but when she replied, there was also a certain concern in her voice. Did everything go all right? Yes, don't worry about it. You were right. The captain promised me to never let Garrett step a foot inside this department ever again. It actually felt pretty satisfying to let it all out. She paused for a moment, sending another soft smile in Alder's direction. I just wanted to thank you again, for encouraging me to speak up. I don't think I would have said anything if it had been for you. Alder dismissed her words with a wave of her hand. Nonsense. I didn't do anything. It was all you. She lowered her voice slightly. Although I still regret not punching Buttonwood myself. The evening had been surprisingly enjoyable until he ruined it. Telly was surprised at how genuine her words sounded, and felt another awkward blush creeping up her cheeks. She tried her best not to let her memories of the enjoyable part of the evening consume her, but the feeling of Alder's arms wrapped around her body was still all too present in her head. Yet she didn't even know if Alder was referring to their dance, or was just making a general remark. So, she decided to better keep her reply vague. Yeah, I definitely had fun, even though it has been a while since the last time I was this drunk. She hoped Alder would just leave it like that, let her blame everything on the alcohol. But of course, she didn't. Instead, she chuckled lightly. Oh, trust me, it's the same for me. I'm definitely too old for waking up with a pounding headache in the morning. Aren't we all? Fair point. She hesitated for a moment, then continued, suddenly sounding slightly husky. Still, alcohol isn't all bad, Sometimes it helps us do things we normally wouldn't. Things we then end up enjoying very much. Shit. Alder was definitely referring to their dance now, and the teasing, almost playful tone of her voice was doing things to Tally's self-control. Again. She could feel Alder's eyes on her and bit her lip, her own eyes everywhere but on the woman opposite her. Well, maybe I wasn't drunk enough then. There were still some things that I would have liked to do. The rush of adrenaline that went through Tally's body finally gave her enough strength to return Alder's intense gaze, and immediately was mesmerized by it. The striking blue of her eyes was so different in moments like these, softer than Tally knew eyes could be. In these moments, the professional detective was gone, replaced by a woman who cared too deeply. Tally could feel it again, that connection between them, that spark that made the rational part of her brain stop working, that spark that made everything but the woman in front of her completely irrelevant. Is that so? Alder's voice was barely more than a whisper. Her eyes were darker now, filled with curiosity and maybe even desire, challenging Tally, daring her. Tally felt her body involuntarily move closer, could feel herself leaning in slightly, could hear Alder's breath hitch when her eyes dropped down to her lips. Tally didn't know just how long they were standing like this, staring at each other, evaluating, wanting. Yet neither of them dared to close the distance between them, to give in to the constant pull between them. Ultimately, it was Alder who cleared her throat and took a small step back, effectively breaking the moment between them. Tally took a deep breath, reminding herself just why exactly this couldn't happen, wouldn't happen. She recalled the words Alder had said to Detective Patan only hours ago, recalled her own promise to herself about maintaining strict boundaries, and damn, she really sucked at this. She was the first to speak again, voice still shaking slightly. Anyway, I guess you didn't bring me up here to have a debate about our alcohol consumption. Smooth, Craven. Very smooth. Fill me in on what you do up here. Did you come up with any new theories? Any suspects? Within seconds, the tense atmosphere between them was gone, and Alder had switched back into a professional mode. She nodded, then guided Tally back through the room, towards a huge bulletin board on the wall, and seemed to make sure to always keep a certain distance between her and Tally. I wouldn't call it theories. I spend most of my time rereading old case files, hoping to find something, anything, I have missed before. But all it does is frustrate me. She stepped closer to the board, pointing at a couple of notes she had put up there. All I can tell you is that the Camarilla killer must be someone powerful, someone with contacts. He always seems to be one step ahead of us. I've been considering a mole on the team, but I've checked everyone over and over again. Everybody is perfectly clean. There are barely any cops that worked on all of the cases, and I know half of them long enough to trust them with my life. So he must be someone with influence, someone charismatic, who knows how to get the information he wants. You know me. I'm a very private person. I don't walk around telling people about my life, about my family. Still, he managed to find my weak spot. He found Elizabeth. He must have connections. Tally stood next to her, eyeing the board with interest. That makes sense. It's far from reassuring, though, she thought for a moment, then continued talking, pointing at the images of the victims that Alder had put up in the center of the board. So what if we step away from the killer again? Focus on the victims more. Try to find a connection between them. Believe me, I tried. They have all been what you could describe as handsome. Still, their appearance was completely different. He doesn't seem to have a type. They were all also very strong and independent women who stood up for themselves. But then again, there's no pattern other than these character traits. They all worked in different jobs and had different interests. Some of them lived roughly in the same area, but that's about it. There's nothing. She was getting more and more frustrated with each sentence, and Tally was struggling to stop herself from reaching out, from putting her hand on her shoulder to comfort her. Then let's take a closer look at the family and friends of the victims. Abigail and I did this with Tanya Flynn this afternoon. We went over the interviews with her husband and parents, and it really gave some interesting insight into her personality. But maybe there's more. I know it's not much, but it's something, right? It's a start. She could see that Alder wasn't convinced. Still, she nodded. Okay. And so their investigation started, and time moved forwards. Days quickly turned into weeks. Fortunately, the Camarilla killer held himself back. There were no new victims, but it also meant that they could no longer spend their full capacities on this case. That was why Tally and Alder started to work on their usual cases during the day, and then met in the attic after their shifts ended. Alder kept telling Tally that she should rest, that she shouldn't spend almost all of her free time with this, and Tally knew she should listen to her, should stop herself from getting too invested. Still, she found herself sitting on the old couch in the attic several evenings of the week, a case file in her hands and a notebook on her lap. Usually, Alder was sitting next to her, a respectable distance between them, and similar items in hand. The work was slow and exhausting, without any noticeable developments made. Still, Tally found it weirdly comforting to work side by side with Alder. One evening, Tally found herself in her usual spot, a large cup of tea standing next to her that would hopefully keep her awake and attentive for a little while longer. It had been a stressful and very busy day. She and Alder had been dealing with an armed robbery in a jewelry store. They had confronted a suspect, and of course, he had tried to escape, causing Tally to chase him through a packed mall and ultimately tackled him down, after what felt like an eternity of running. She was used to the physical exercise, but the man had been almost twice her size and had put up much of a fight. She could already feel a couple of bruises beginning to form on her arms. Her muscles felt tense, and her bones were protesting at every movement she made. She was incredibly tired and couldn't wait to fall into her bed. Still, once her shift had ended, her legs had automatically carried her up the small staircase to the attic. Alder had arrived only minutes after her. She had raised her eyebrows disapprovingly once she had spotted Tally in her usual spot on the couch, obviously not all too pleased about seeing her here, rather than being on her way home. But she had known better than to try and convince Tally to leave. It seemed she was beginning to understand that Tally was just as stubborn as she was. So, she had simply sighed and freed her hair out of the strict braid it had been in all day. Then she had sat down next to Tally and grabbed the file she was currently working on, without another word. Tally tried her best to focus, but her shoulders were starting to throb. She kept shifting on the couch uncomfortably, trying to find a position that would ease her tired muscles, and groaned silently. After watching her silent battle for a while, Alder put down her file and turned her head to look at Tally. Rough day? Yeah, that robber got me good. Craven, maybe you shouldn't be here if you can't even manage to sit on the couch. I'm sorry, I feel like my body hates me. I can barely move my shoulders. I think I must have pinched a nerve. Alder was about to respond, but then simply closed her mouth again. She seemed to be contemplating her next move for a couple of seconds. Then, apparently, came to the conclusion, let out a loud sigh, and got up from the couch. Tally turned her head and watched how she walked around it until she was standing directly behind Tally. Sit up straight and close your eyes. Her firm words didn't leave room for questions, so Tally simply obeyed. She closed her eyes, and soon after could feel Alder place both of her hands on her shoulders. Tally felt her heart skip a beat at the contact, and quickly bit her lip to avoid a sigh from escaping. She could feel Alder's hands starting to move, slowly, and cautiously at first, but then more firmly. She kneaded the knots of Tally's shoulders, trying to ease the tension. Tally gulped involuntarily. God, this felt so good. When her fingers started to knead a particularly sensitive spot, Tally could feel her eyelids flutter, could feel herself leaning into the touch even further, and then let out a low and definitely very inappropriate moan. Tally's eyes flung open, embarrassment creeping over her. Alder's fingers paused in her movement as she could feel her partner tensing up slightly, could hear her taking in a raspy breath, but then she simply continued to dig her fingers deep into Tally's shoulders, drawing a couple of more stifled moans from her. When Alder finally retreated her hands, Tally was more relaxed than she had been in weeks, and the tense muscles in her shoulders already felt much better. Also, she couldn't help but wonder just what other things Alder's hands could do to her body. In fact, That thought started to become a bit too overwhelming, which is why Tally spoke again without thinking it through. Damn, you really have some skilled fingers. Then her brain cut up, and she blushed. Shit, that came out wrong, but Alder only let out a low chuckle that went straight between Tally's legs. I'm glad to hear that. So, you're feeling better? Much, thank you. Alder hummed approvingly, and when she walked back around the couch, Tally noticed that she looked a bit flustered herself, her cheeks slightly more colored, her eyes much darker than usual. When Alder sat back down, they were sitting much closer than before, but neither of them really seemed to mind. For once, Tally let herself enjoy the comfortable warmth that Alder's body radiated. She even allowed herself to slightly lean in when their thighs touched, and didn't immediately pull away when their fingers accidentally brushed against each other. As the time passed, however, Tally could feel her focus slip away slightly. Her body was still relaxed from Alder's massage, and she felt tired to her bones. There was a comfortable silence between her and Alder, only interrupted by the sounds of pages being turned and notes scribbled down. Slowly, the words were starting to blur in front of her eyes. The scent of Alder's perfume and the feeling of her body gently pressing into Tally's side were clouding her thoughts. Her limbs suddenly felt very heavy. She was struggling to keep her eyes open and finally gave in, closed them for only the briefest of seconds. She could feel herself drifting away, letting the relaxing darkness pull her in. When Tally opened her eyes again, everything around her remained dark. She was feeling disoriented and needed a moment to understand why she wasn't able to see anything. Then she felt something tickling her nose, and suddenly, the scent of Alder's perfume was everywhere. She froze as her brain slowly started to work properly again, and she was beginning to process what was happening. She must have fallen asleep. Worse even. She must have fallen asleep, and her head was now resting comfortably on Alder's shoulder, face buried deep in her mess of black hair. Tally, startled, immediately moved into an upright position. She could feel her whole body protesting at the quick movement, and was immediately missing the comfortability of Alder's shoulder. She shifted awkwardly on the couch, thoughts spiraling, and when she finally dared to turn her head in the direction of her partner, couldn't suppress a soft smile at the view in front of her. Apparently, she hadn't been the only one who had let the exhaustion of the day take over. Alder had dozed off as well. Her eyes were closed, her posture relaxed, her mouth slightly open, her features soft, for once, bare of any tension, and she looked so peaceful, completely at ease with herself. A loose strand of her hair was tangling right in front of her eyes, and Tally automatically reached out to brush it behind her ear. She let her hand linger for a moment longer on Alder's cheek, grazing it gently. Alder stirred slightly, leaned into the touch, and mumbled something incomprehensible. For a second, Tally was afraid she had woken her up, but her eyes remained closed, and her breathing even. She reluctantly withdrew her hand, not wanting to get caught in such an intimate position. She considered waking Alder, but couldn't get herself to do it. She was glad her partner was finally getting some rest, and she didn't want to take that from her. Instead, she slowly got up from the couch and grabbed a woolen blanket. She unfolded the blanket and spread it over her sleeping partner, who immediately grabbed it and snuggled into it. It was adorable, and no matter how creepy it sounded, Tally thought she could watch Alder sleep for hours, but she could hardly just sit here all night. In fact, she shouldn't even sit here at all. Out of the blue, a wave of sadness washed over Tally. Suddenly, she was overwhelmed by the whole intimacy of the situation. Once more, she realized that she was feeling too much for the sleeping woman in front of her. She wasn't sure how to deal with everything on her own any longer, and was starting to get afraid that it might mess up her job, might mess up the life she had been working so hard for. She needed to get out of here, needed to clear her head. So she took one last longing gaze at her partner, and then forced herself to turn around. She switched off the lights, then headed downstairs and left the building. The image of Alder cuddled up on the couch forever imprinted into her memory. Tally had decided to walk home. had hoped that fresh night air would help clear her head. It didn't. Instead, she felt weirdly melancholy when she opened the door to her apartment. Her head was full of things that could be, of seemingly impossible possibilities and confusing feelings. To her surprise, both Raelle and Abigail were still awake, sitting on the kitchen table, 2 steaming mugs of tea in front of them. They greeted her with knowing smirks. My, what do we have here? I can't believe my eyes. Is that Telly Craven? I believe it is, but I haven't seen her in so long, I can barely remember what she looked like. Tell us, stranger, is it really you? Telly raised her hand in playful defeat, allowing herself to forget her mess of thoughts for a moment, and grinned at the teasing comments. Telly Craven in the flesh, reporting for duty. She saluted mockingly, and Raelle and Abigail raised their mugs in her direction. She felt Raelle's eyes on her, and soon her best friend started to speak once more. No, seriously, Tell, how can it be that you're the only single woman in the household, yet this is the first evening in weeks that you show up here before midnight? Raelle sounded genuinely interested, rather than accusing, and raised her eyebrows, teasingly. Enjoying your time with Alder in the attic a little bit too much, eh? Telly's face twitched at the comment, reminding her of all her conflicting feelings she was currently trying to push down. She had told Abigail and Raelle about her meetings with Alder in the attic. She obviously had left out details, tried to keep their investigation as private as possible. Still, she was not one to have secrets from her best friends, and had to explain somehow why she kept coming home late these days. Telly could feel Raelle and Abigail watching her. She shifted uncomfortably under their gaze, not quite ready to explain herself, but also no longer able to keep all of her emotions bottled up inside of her. Telly, are you good? I was just joking. Raelle smiled at her apologetically, and Telly let out a frustrated sigh. She could feel her shoulders drop in resignation. No, I don't think I'm good. That was all it needed. Abigail immediately got up to get Telly her own cup of tea, and Raelle wordlessly gestured in the direction of the empty seat next to them. Telly sat down and buried her head in her hands. She could feel Raelle wrapping her arms around her shoulder, and was grateful for the support. Still, she wasn't quite sure where to start, didn't know how to put her misery into words. So she waited until Abigail had placed a steaming mug in front of her, sat back down again, and then blurted out the first thing that came to her mind. How did you know you like women? There was a moment of silence in which Abigail and Raelle exchanged a silent glance. Then Raelle started to speak again, answering her seriously, and without questioning her motives. I don't think there's a general answer to this, you know. It's different for everybody, and it's really hard to describe. But I think I just knew. I always looked at women differently than I did at men. Found them more appealing, softer in a way. And I could feel my body reacting to them, making me feel things that, at some point, I just couldn't ignore any longer. To me, it's not necessarily a gender thing, Abigail added. They're just people that you feel drawn to, that fascinate you, and that you can't get off your mind, no matter how hard you try. Telly nodded silently, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Abigail couldn't bear the silence any longer and spoke out what they all were thinking. So, you and Alder, huh? Telly closed her eyes and buried her head inside her hands. I don't know, it's all just so messy, she mumbled, barely audible through her fingers. She's driving me crazy. Like whenever I'm with her, my brain just stops working. I kept telling myself that it's only because I have looked up to her for so long, but the way my body reacts around her, the way my head keeps making up the most inappropriate scenarios when she's close to me, I think there's no point in denying that I am completely fucked. I think it's rather that you want to be fucked. Abigail Bellwether. What? I'm just saying. Abigail shrugged, and Telly felt herself blushing when she realized that maybe Abigail's words hit a little bit too close to the truth. The sad thing is that I can't even say that you're wrong. Telly huffed in frustration. God, this feels like high school all over again. I think the worst thing is that deep down I know it will never happen. But then there are these moments where Alder says something, That's just so fucking inappropriate. And then she looks at me like I always look at her. There's this weird connection between us, and I feel so drawn to her. It's crazy. But even if she sees something else, then her annoying partner in me, she won't act on it because she's so caught up in her own mess and determined to not let anyone close to her. The words were tumbling out of her mouth now, and with each sentence, Tally felt a little bit lighter, as if actual weight would be lifted off of her. She was speaking so fast now that Raelle and Abigail didn't even get a chance to interrupt her at any point. I don't even know how to act around her. I try to act calm on the outside, which already only works like half of the time, and on the inside, I'm a raging mess of confused gay panic. I don't know if she understands what she is doing to me, and even if she doesn't, Detective Bataan definitely knows, and keeps making these insufferable comments, not even bothering who might be hearing them. Tally, breathe. Abigail gently wrapped her hand around Tally's wrist, pulling it towards her and forcing her to look up. Tally hadn't even realized how fast her heart was beating. She took a deep, shaky breath and closed her eyes in an attempt to calm down a bit. I'm sorry. I think all of this needed to get out of me for a while now. But God, I'm a mess. This is just so embarrassing and stupid. Tally, it's neither embarrassing nor stupid. Honestly, it sticks out a mile that there's some sort of tension between you and Alder. You're definitely not imagining things. Abigail's words reassured Tally more than she cared to admit. At least she didn't seem to be completely delusional. It was Raelle who spoke next. Even I knew there was something going on, Tal, and I have only seen you two together twice. It's obvious that she cares about you a lot. She's probably just as confused and overwhelmed as you are, just better at hiding it. Tally shrugged. Maybe. But what am I going to do about all of this? Who says you have to do anything? You have all the time in the world, and the Camarilla killer won't be on the loose forever. I know this is easier said than done, but don't stress yourself too much over it. Go with the flow, see where each new day leads you, and I'm sure Abigail can kick that Detective Bataan's butt when she keeps bugging you. Abigail nodded a little too eagerly at this, and Tally felt once more incredibly grateful to have these two amazing women in her life. She chuckled slightly. When did you become so wise, Ray? I guess dating someone who works with the dead each day somehow makes you appreciate the living even more. No, but honestly, Tal, talk to us no matter how silly it feels. Don't start bottling all of your feelings up again. Tally nodded. She was already feeling much calmer. Her rambling had felt somewhat therapeutic and had taken a lot of the pressure she had put on herself away. Thank you guys, really. I love you. Oh, we love you too, Tal. Now can we please talk about something else? Raelle's eyes started to shine, and she looked at Tally and Abigail expectantly. How about that crazy serial killer of yours? That's not what I expected to hear, but okay. Come on, you know I'm totally into that stuff. Look, I know you can't share any details with me, but just give me the basics. What is this guy up to? Are you close to catching him? Both Tally and Abigail hesitated for a moment, but Tally quickly gave in with a sigh. It's not like Raelle would run around telling everyone about their case. She was sharing a flat with two detectives and was dating the medical examiner of the case, so she already was way too close anyway. Plus, she was a quick thinker with unusual ideas, so maybe she would actually be able to help them. So, Tally quickly filled her in on the case, leaving out some of the details they were definitely not allowed to share, and also in what way Alder was really involved in this. She now understood why Abigail had insisted that it wasn't her story to tell. So, in conclusion, we know nothing and that bastard is still out there, murdering women like it's nothing. Tally concluded her report with the depressing truth. Raelle, however, had a thoughtful expression on her face and frowned. Maybe that's because you keep looking at this from the police perspective. Abigail sent her a rather confused look. Yeah, because we are the police. Exactly my point. You need to think out of your usual box. Think like a serial killer would. And you need to start at the beginning. You keep searching for connections between the victims, but who says there are any? Go back as far as you can and start with the first victim. If you cannot find a common reason for why he killed the other victims, there definitely must be one for killing her. The first is usually special. Nobody simply becomes a killer out of boredom. Something must have driven him to go that far, and that first kill made him realize how much he enjoyed this. Her little speech was followed by stunned silence. Tally took a moment to think this through, then broke the silence, not even trying to hide how impressed she was. Damn, Rael, and I thought I was good at profiling people. Rael only shook her head, dismissing the compliment. We both know you are usually so much better at this than I am. Sometimes it just needs a pair of fresh eyes, I guess. It's moments like these where I wish you'd still be one of us. The power we would hold. Oh, shush. Where would your outsider perspective be if I'd still be a cop? Plus, we already are unstoppable, and you know I'm really happy with what I do now. Tully nodded understandingly. You've got a point. They moved on from the case after this and talked for a little while longer about everything and nothing. Still, Rael's words stuck with Tally, and the more she thought about them, the more sense they made. The first victim of the Camarilla killer had been a young woman called Penelope Silver. She had only turned 18 and had been by far the youngest victim. Tally remembered going through her case file, but quickly giving up on it, as it had barely contained any valuable information. She remembered reading about her father being in law enforcement as well. They had also interviewed a couple of her friends back then, but they all hadn't given them any indication of being involved in the case, so the matter had been dropped pretty quickly, and neither of them gave much information about Penelope. Her case had primarily been treated as a normal homicide case, because the second victim was only murdered months after her, and hasn't really been revisited since. Changing their perspective and revisiting her case, taking into consideration what they had found out now, actually made perfect sense. So the first thing she did, when she arrived in the bullpen the next morning, was to wave Detective Batan and Alder over, to tell her about that theory. She observed Alder and Batan exchanging a quick, meaningful glance at the mention of Penelope's name, but once she finished talking, both detectives looked rather impressed. Especially Detective Batan seemed to be over the moon. Craven, I could kiss you right now. She risked a carefully calculated glance at Alder. But I also want to leave this room alive, so if you'll excuse me for a moment, I need to make a call and then talk to the captain. She turned around and left Tally alone with Alder. Tally looked at her in confusion. Oh, what's all that about? Can't we just make a couple of phone calls and invite her family and friends over? To do some more interviews? Alder sighed, gently massaging her temples with her fingers. Apparently, she still hadn't gotten as much rest as she would have needed. I'm afraid this case is a bit more delicate than that. Why is that? Because Penelope's father is no other than Blenton Silver. Tally blinked, confused for a moment. Then realization hit her. As in Director Silver? The very same. And let me tell you this. This man is a massive pain in the ass. Tally didn't know much about the current director of the FBI. So far, her investigation hadn't made her cross paths with any detectives of the Bureau, and her whole knowledge came from back at the academy. Silver had climbed the ladder rather quickly. He must be around the same age as Alder, and was known to be ruthless, especially when it came to saving his career. So how are we going to deal with it? Nicta has connections. She's probably calling one of her FBI friends right now, testing the waters. We can't do these sorts of interviews via phone or video calls, and he can hardly clear his schedule to take a quick 7-hour trip from Washington for a simple interview. So if he actually agrees to speak with us, this probably only leaves us one option. At that moment, Nicta busted back into the office. She looked at Tally and Alder, a grim smile on her lips. Ladies, pack a bag. We're going on a road trip. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.